Thank you, everybody, for joining us. We're excited to have author Jack Kelly speak about his book, God Save Benedict Arnold, The True Story of America's Most Hated Man. Jack Kelly is an award-winning author and historian. His books include Band of Giants, The Amateur Soldiers Who Won America's Independence, which received the DAR Dar History Medal. He is the author of Valcor, The Edge of Anarchy, Heaven's Ditch, and Gunpowder. He has published several novels and is a New York Foundation of the Arts Fellow in Nonfiction Literature. Kelly has appeared on the History Channel, National Public Radio, and C-SPAN. And you could go to his website, jackkellybooks.com, to find out more about his Substack weekly newsletter. And we'll get to his presentation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Jeff. Thank you to everyone for tuning in tonight. I wanted to just start out mentioning a couple of reasons why I wrote this book. I think Benedict Arnold has always fascinated me, and I think is one of the most interesting characters of that era, and in many ways, one of the more interesting characters in American history. And everybody that knows Benedict Arnold knows one thing about him. I'm not even going to say what that is because everybody knows what it is. But I wrote the book in order to get across the idea that there's more to Benedict Arnold than that one thing, and that it's really important to understand Arnold in order to understand the Revolutionary War. And I also felt that we're coming up to the 250th anniversary of the Revolution. It's a way of getting into the war because Benedict Arnold was involved in all the major events of the first 3 years of the war. If you just follow his career, you get a good picture of what those 3 years, very crucial years of the Revolutionary War were like. So the Revolutionary War began on the morning of April 19, 1775, when the British at Lexington Green shot and killed 8 Minutemen, and then the Patriots came back and killed 70 of the King's soldiers, and the war was on. Benedict Arnold marched off to war immediately on hearing the news of Lexington. He had a small company of militia in New Haven where he lived, and he ended up 3 weeks later, on May 10th of 1775, capturing the most strategic fortification in the 13 colonies at Fort Ticonderoga on Lake Champlain. And he not only captured the fort, but he then went up to Canada on his own initiative without orders from anybody and captured a warship up there, a British warship that was the only warship that the British had on Lake Champlain, and thereby secured Lake Champlain for the Patriots for the next couple of years. The question always arises then, was that a significant? And I think it was, because if you look at a map, there's a waterway that runs from Montreal down the Richelieu River, Lake Champlain, Lake George, skips over to the Hudson River, and then all the way down to New York City. And that was somewhat of a superhighway of that time during the Revolutionary era. And the British strategic objective was to take control of that water corridor and to isolate New England, split the colonies, and thereby win the war, which it was very possible they would do it. But with the Patriots controlling Fort Ticonderoga, which was right in the middle, it put a crimp in that plan. So it was important for that reason. And it was also important because the cannon that they were able to confiscate at Fort Ticonderoga the following winter were shipped across the state of Massachusetts on sleds, and gave George Washington his first victory of the Revolutionary War by driving the British out of Boston in March of 1776. So for those two things alone, this was one of the most strategic moves of the Revolutionary War. Um, and what do they say in the history books? It's barely a footnote, given very little attention, very little recognition. And um, sometimes they give the credit to Ethan Allen and the Green Mountain Boys, who did participate in the takeover of Ticonderoga. But it was really Benedict Arnold who had the idea for it, who provided the leadership, and most importantly, provided that initiative to take control of the lake. So this was a great achievement of Benedict Arnold. And the next question is then, do we owe it to Benedict Arnold to get the history right? I don't think we do. Benedict Arnold was certainly a traitor, and nothing in my book in any way exonerates him from his treason. And in fact, I think in many ways his treason was more severe than many people think. So we don't owe him anything, but we owe it to ourselves to get the history right, to understand and iron out the discrepancies in history. Another reason is that Benedict Arnold was a paradox. He was a hero and he was a villain. He promoted the revolution and fought gallantly for the revolution, and he tried to destroy the revolution. The tendency is for, and it has been for historians going back many years, to downplay that paradox by saying he wasn't a hero at all. His achievements were really pretty minor. His participation was minimal. His motives were bad. Some of the early biographies even would say that he was a nasty little boy. He would sprinkle broken glass on paths in order so that other children would cut their feet. These were made up stories in order to get across the idea that he was a traitor from the cradle. And that's a type of history that's sort of the Parson Weems history that goes along with George Washington could never tell a lie. Benedict Arnold was a scoundrel from the beginning. The real history, or history for adults, I might say, is that people are complicated and people can be conflicted. People can have change of heart. And in many ways, Benedict Arnold actually represented or reflected the times that he lived in, because the country was very divided. There were loyalists and patriots, and they were very much at odds and at each other's throats. And a lot of people went back and forth and had changes of heart, or would swear to be faithful to the king one day and then join the patriots the next day. So it was, though he seems like a uniquely bad traitor, Benedict Arnold was in some ways an embodiment of the times that he lived in. We jump to 1776. Now we see the value of taking over Ticonderoga and controlling Lake Champlain. This is a replica of a gunboat that Benedict Arnold would have sailed on Lake Champlain during 1776. That was built by the Lake Champlain Maritime Museum. Because the British decided to launch that very invasion that I spoke of earlier, of coming down from Canada and splitting the colonies. But they weren't able to do it because the fact that the Patriots controlled Lake Champlain. If they tried to move their army down to Ticonderoga on transport ships, they would have been vulnerable to these American gunboats and other American warships. So they had to build their own fleet up in Canada. And there began in the summer of 1776 a arms race. The British were up here in St. John's on the Richelieu River, and Benedict Arnold was in Skenesboro, which is now Whitehall, New York. building more gunboats, more warships to meet the British. The British had many more resources, built much larger ships, much more powerful ships with all the resources of the Royal Navy. Um, and this went on all summer. Finally, Benedict Arnold took his small fleet, sailed up to the north end of Lake Champlain, waited for the British to come down. He was trying to uh, delay as much as possible. They knew they couldn't really defeat the British, but if they could delay and delay, maybe they could put off this invasion. And the British, wanting to have overwhelming firepower, kept building more and more ships and did delay. Arnold pulled his fleet back to Valcour Island, which was about a mile off the New York shore, and there was a protected bay there, and he put his small fleet in there to protect them from the weather partly, and to sort of hide them from any ships coming down the lake. And he stayed there until the 11th of October. Finally, the British did come down. They did have overwhelming firepower, much bigger ships, cannon, and Arnold's second in command said, "Well, we've got to get out of here. This is going to be suicidal if we stay in this little blind bay beside Valcour Island." And Arnold said, "No, I have a plan. We're going to fight the Royal Navy. We're going to defeat them." And they waited for the British to come down to go past the island. And this is a contemporary map of the battle, they then sent a boat out and fired at the British from behind. The British had to turn around and sail north. There was no entrance to this bay in the north end because it was shallow water there. So they had to come in from the south, going against the wind. And the bigger ships, which you see out here, the bigger British ships, were not able to get up into the bay. So they had to fight with their gunboats. This represents the American line of ships that Arnold decided to fight from anchor and to fire their cannon from anchor. So they didn't have to bother with sailing and trying to sail and shoot at the same time. And the British had what is here represented as a line of gunboats, and they fire back and forth for 7 hours. Very brutal form of warfare, a lot of cannonballs flying, grape shot, etc. It got dark. Americans were still standing. The British had not been able to break through that line of ships. But Americans had expended 3/4 of their ammunition. A lot of their boats were damaged. Now what were they going to do? Arnold had a plan, and the escape from Valcour Island, which was directly through the blockade that the British set up across the mouth of the bay, is almost like a fairy tale. They were able to escape very quietly in the middle of the night and head down the lake. There was more fighting down the lake. The American fleet was largely destroyed, but by the time the British got their army down to Fort Ticonderoga, it was already getting on to November, and they decided it was too late in the season. They were afraid that the lake would freeze, and that would prevent them from getting back and prevent supplies from getting down to them. So they decided to go back and start afresh in the spring. So the campaign in the North in 1776, very crucial campaign, was a total success in that it stopped this British invasion. Was it an important achievement for Arnold? I think it was, because if you look at the other end of the long water corridor down in New York City, George Washington lost the biggest battle of the entire war in Brooklyn in August. He was pushed out of New York City in September. They fought another battle up in White Plains, didn't succeed there, crossed over to New Jersey. The British took Fort Lee, Hackensack, pushed Washington back all the way across the entire state of New Jersey until he was out in Pennsylvania. His 20,000 man army had shrunk to 3,000 men. And he wrote a letter at that time to his brother, and he said, I think the game is pretty near up. And I think that if he'd had to worry about an invasion coming down the Hudson River from Canada, it would have been curtains for the 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 Patriot cause was really hanging in the balance. But instead, Benedict Arnold and Horatio Gates, who's also had been in command of Ticonderoga, brought more than 600 men down the Hudson River to Kingston, and then marched from Kingston to join Washington out in Pennsylvania. And some of the men who fought at Valcour Island also crossed the Delaware on Christmas night and participated with George Washington in what was probably his most spectacular victory of the war when he defeated the Hessians in Trenton the next day, and really changed the fortunes of the war and revived the Patriot cause altogether. So, what do they say about the Northern Campaign in the history books? I can't say that it's just a footnote because there was a book written a few years ago called Valcour, the 1776 campaign that saved the cause of liberty, which I wrote myself. Anyway, I skipped past it. There we go. And yet, when I was researching that book, I was surprised at how little had been written about this very important campaign in the North that in that probably one of the most crucial years of the entire Revolutionary War. So we jump ahead to 1777. This is Benedict Arnold's house in New Haven. He had one of the largest homes in New Haven, very successful businessman before the war. He was home on leave in the winter of 1777 and going into the spring. And in April, he got word that the British had invaded Connecticut. And they had landed on Campo Beach, which was then in Norwalk, is now Westport, I believe, and were marching inland. They weren't sure where they'd gone at the time. Arnold took off from New Haven with General David Wooster, who was the head of the militia in Connecticut. And they gathered a few militiamen, but they didn't have a big force, and they marched down through Bridgeport down to Fairfield. And when they got to Fairfield, they were told that the British had marched inland about 25 miles to Danbury. Danbury was one of the largest of the supply depots for the Patriots. And it supplied not only Connecticut, but the army that was over on the Hudson River in New York. The Patriots had chosen Danbury because they thought it was far enough inland that the British wouldn't raid from the coast. They had a lot of mobility going up and down the coast in their ships. But they did, and they sent a loyalist and some very crack British troops, 1,500 men marching up into Danbury. They didn't have enough wagons to take the material out, so they burned almost everything and spent a day and a half burning tents and shoes and food and ruining the cannon and the muskets that were there. And then they heard that Benedict Arnold and Wooster had followed them and were in Reading approaching Bethel. And so the commander of the British forces decided to go west and then come down through Ridgefield, Wilton, and back to get on their ships back on the coast. Wooster and Arnold decided to split their force, even though it was a fairly small force. And Arnold would ride across the very rugged terrain that separates Reading from Ridgefield, and Wooster would go into Danbury and then follow the British down and harass them from the rear. So that was their plan. Um, they when Arnold got over to Ridgefield, he had his sort of pickup team of militiamen and some of the Ridgefield militia. The Ridgefield militia unit had only been started a few days before, so they had hardly had time to have a drill. And they built a barricade across the road. This is a artist's depiction of what the battle sort of looked like. They built a barricade across the road and then hid behind it, and were going to stop the British from proceeding south. They were still very much outnumbered. And I like to, in writing about these events, to get across the idea that this was not a costume drama. This was a very real thing. And if you can imagine early spring morning, sun shining, and the patriots standing there behind that barricade, waiting, and in the distance they could hear musket fire, and that was Wooster uh, um, harassing the British from behind. Then it was quiet again, musket fire in the far distance, and then a very ominous booming of cannon. The British had several cannon with them, and they shifted a couple of them to the rear, and they fired on Wooster's force. And in that encounter, David Wooster, who was 66 years old, he was still in the fight. At what in those days was considered a very old man. Um, he was shot in the groin and would die from his wounds a few days later. Then it was quiet again, and then they heard the drums, and then they heard the band playing. And the drums were partly a signal and partly a way of intimidating the enemy. And it was like the 4th of July parade, where you could hear it in the far distance, and sort of exciting. But in this case, it was men coming to kill you. And along the way, there was farm children watching this parade. You know, the colorful uniforms, the British dragoons that had death head emblems on their helmets. And the kids, I'm sure, were very excited by this. You know, they'd never seen anything like this. Um, Marching and marching, and finally unlimbering their cannon and firing on the men standing behind that barricade. And the Patriots were able to duck down and then stand up and give them a volley. Inflicted quite a few casualties there, but they didn't have enough men to hold off this long column of British soldiers who started going around both sides of them. Benedict Arnold on his horse trying to steady the line and keep them firing as much as they could at the British. They then gradually pulled back. This is an image of, a lot of people are probably familiar with this. There's a museum in Ridgefield to this day, the Keeler Tavern Museum, and this was a cannonball that embedded itself in the corner post of that building, and is still there. It's on view today. The British spent the night in Ridgefield and then marched down to Wilton, and Benedict Arnold set up another barricade at the bridge that went over this river here, Saugatuck River, but the British found a ford that was farther upstream and were able to get across. There was quite a bit more fighting down there. The next day, the British took even more casualties, but finally got down to their ships and got back on their ships and escaped. The significance of the whole campaign was that the British paid a very high price, and what they would consider too high a price, for the raid, that it was not the cakewalk that they thought it was going to be, to go in, destroy the supplies, and leave. Uh, and so John Adams thought that Benedict Arnold deserved a gold medal. He said Congress should strike a gold medal for the achievement at Richfield. But again, if you look at the history books, the Battle of Ridgefield is barely a footnote. It's probably more well known in Connecticut, but in the whole history of the battle, it's not really um, given all that much weight. And yet, I think that given the importance of supply in the Revolutionary War, that it was a crucial thing to stop these raids, stop the British, discourage the British from raiding these supply depots. And there's sort of a catchphrase that they say that armchair generals talk about battles, but real generals talk about logistics. And in the Revolutionary War in particular, supply was a very, very crucial thing. And Arnold dealt with it as well as he could, given the resources that he had. Very soon after that, in July of 1777, Arnold got word that Fort Ticonderoga had fallen finally after the 2 years that since he'd captured it, and 2 years plus. And General John Burgoyne had led an army down from Canada. There was nothing really to stop him on Lake Champlain anymore after the American fleet had been defeated the year before. Was able to take Ticonderoga very easily and was on the march towards Albany. Benedict Arnold jumped on a horse, rode to the scene of the action, joined General Horatio Gates, who was in command there. They decided to meet General Burgoyne on the high ground a few miles south of the village of Saratoga. They fought two battles there, which are collectively referred to as the Battle of Saratoga. And in both battles, the General Burgoyne tried to sweep around the left end of the American lines. In both battles, Benedict Arnold commanded the left division of the American forces. In the first battle, he fought Burgoyne to a standstill and inflicted heavy casualties. And in the second battle, he defeated Burgoyne decisively and then personally led a charge into the British field fortifications, broke through, and put Burgoyne in a position that he said he had to do what he said he would never do, which is to retreat. Benedict Arnold was severely wounded in that battle, but General Burgoyne 10 days later had to surrender his entire army to General Gates. So was that an important achievement? Well, it's called the turning point of the Revolutionary War, and it very much did change the complexion of the war, brought the French in. Time magazine said that the Battle of Saratoga was the single most important battle fought anywhere in the world in the last 1,000 years. So it certainly sounds like it was pretty important. What do they say in the history books? Many of the accounts of the Battle of Saratoga have tried to downplay the role of Benedict Arnold because of the fact that he was a traitor, because they wanted him not to have this sense of glory. And there were stories that he was drunk, even though he didn't even drink. There were stories that he had been relieved of his command, or was sulking in his cabin, or he never went out on the battlefield. Well, they couldn't deny that he was on the battlefield because he was severely wounded during the battle. But they said he was riding around like a crazy man. He wasn't really directing the battle. Many of those stories have been debunked, and historians are now turning away from those accounts that diminish Arnold's role and recognizing that Benedict Arnold was the key person in one of the most important battles of the Revolutionary War. Um, 3 years later, we come to the one thing that everybody knows about Arnold, which was he was a traitor. This was an effigy they pulled through the streets of Philadelphia. Um, the question, of course, is why did he go over to the British side? Um, and there's been many reasons proposed over the years. A lot of historians have their favorite theories why it is. Some say it was for the money the British paid him. They paid him to hand over the fort at West Point. Some say that his wife induced him to switch sides. He'd married a loyalist leaning young lady from Philadelphia, Peggy Shippen. Some said that he didn't like the French alliance. Some said that he didn't like the idea of independence. Some said that he was disgruntled over promotions that he didn't get from Congress. My own answer is that why did Benedict Arnold change sides? I don't know. And I don't think any of the reasons that have been proposed in themselves really carry enough weight to make to explain this momentous change of heart in Arnold. And I sometimes wonder if he knew himself. He was not an introspective person. He tended to just act on impulse, and uh, the why of what he did may forever be a mystery. But he did do it, and he never did anything by halves. So he got control of command of the lower Hudson Valley, which included West Point, which is up here. It was not a military academy. It was a very important fort on the Hudson River. And he offered to allow the British to take it over. And the unfolding of that plot, I think, is one of the great dramas of history. Shakespeare wrote a lot of dramas about history, but history sometimes creates its own dramas, and this was one of them because Arnold met with the head of British intelligence here in Haverstraw one night in September of 1780, Major John Andre. Um, he gave Andre a map of West Point, information about the troop deployment, some other documents, and then Arnold went back to his headquarters, which were on the opposite side of the river from West Point. And Major Andre, after some delays, headed down towards New York to set the events in motion. And he got down as far as he was riding on horseback on the east side of the Hudson River, and he got as far as Tarrytown. He was very excited and he was very nervous. And he was excited because he had pulled off the biggest intelligence coup of the war. And he was nervous because this land of Westchester County was no man's land. It was above the British lines, but below the American lines. And it was patrolled by both Patriot and Loyalist militia units. And so, sure enough, 3 men jumped out of the bushes and stopped him. And Major Andre um, made the mistake, I think, of saying, "I hope you're of our party." And one of the militiamen said, "Well, what party is that?" So then Andre had to guess, and he said, "The lower party," meaning the British down in New York. And the man said, "No, we're Americans. Get down." They searched him. They found the documents, very suspicious looking. And they took him to their commander, Colonel Jameson. Colonel Jameson was, I think, a little slow on the uptake because he immediately sent a message off to his commanding officer, Benedict Arnold. But then he started thinking, like, wait a minute, these documents are in Arnold's hand. There's something really funny going on. I think I'll send them up to George Washington. And there comes in a little plot twist because George Washington wasn't in the American camp, which was over on the New Jersey border, but had been out to meet with some French officers in Hartford, Connecticut, and was on his way back and was scheduled to have breakfast with Benedict Arnold the next morning at his headquarters, and then the two of them were going to go over and inspect the fortifications at West Point. So you have a very tense situation where there's two separate couriers heading towards Arnold's headquarters because the second courier found out that's where Washington would be found, with these messages. Some of George Washington's aides arrived. They said the general's right up the road. He'll be here in a few minutes. The first courier arrived, handed a letter to Benedict Arnold. Arnold read it. He said to his wife, "I got to go." Told everybody else, he said, "I'm going over to West Point." But when he jumped in his boat down on the river, he told his crew to row as fast as they could to the south. Washington arrived. Arnold's not there. He's gone over to West Point. So Washington said, "Well, we'll go over and do the inspection now." So he took his entourage across the river. They got over there. The people hadn't seen Benedict Arnold in 2 days. They started looking at the fortifications. They were falling down. There was not enough men there. There was something very strange going on. Later, Washington described his own thinking, and he said, "My mind misgave me, but I had not the least idea of the real cause." And it was not one of those feelings I think we all can appreciate, where you know something's wrong, but you can't figure out exactly what it is. So, being the imperturbable person that he was, Washington went back to Arnold's headquarters and decided to take a nap. Before he lay down in bed, the second courier arrived, gave him the documents. He immediately saw through what was going on. He called in Henry Knox, who was his most trusted subordinate, and he said, "Arnold has betrayed us. Who can we trust now?" And it was not a rhetorical question because he didn't know how far the plot went. He didn't know who was involved. He sent Alexander Hamilton tearing down the Hudson River on horseback to try to catch up with Arnold. He sent a message over to the army to get as many troops as they could marching to protect West Point. And then the real drama began as Arnold's wife, Peggy Shippen, and this sort of ironically, I guess you would say, is a drawing of her that was drawn by Major Andre himself back when Peggy Shippen, the British controlled Philadelphia, and Peggy was flirting with the British officers. She started tearing her clothes off and screaming. She had to see Washington. They were going to kill her baby. What about her husband? They thought she was shocked by his treason. They didn't suspect that she was in on the plot all along and was in fact trying to give her husband a chance to escape. He did escape. He made it down to a British ship down in the Hudson River, joined the British, fought with them for about a year on the British side against the Americans. Then after Yorktown, went over to England and never set foot in America again. And a few days after Major Andre, this is a self-portrait Andre drew of himself waiting his trial. He'd been discovered in civilian clothes and about 10 days later was hanged as a spy. Once the men who captured Andre were given these medals for fidelity, which was in contrast to Arnold, the first military decorations ever awarded in American history. They'd stayed faithful to the cause. A few days after the uh, treason was revealed, one of Arnold's aides said, wouldn't it have been better if the bullet that went through his leg at Saratoga had gone through his heart? And a lot of historians have repeated a similar idea that if Benedict Arnold had been killed at Saratoga, he would be remembered as one of our greatest heroes. And I think from the accomplishments that I've discussed this evening, that you can see the logic of that thinking. But I don't really think it's true. I think that if Benedict Arnold had been killed at Saratoga, he would have been forgotten, just like Nathaniel Greene and Henry Knox and many of the other heroes of the Revolution, other than George Washington, have been forgotten by the general public. And I think I'm hopeful that as we approach the 250th anniversary of the Revolution, can be some new attention given to those who fought in the war, and particularly the men in the ranks, went through a great deal of hardship in order to create this country. And if you read the letters and diaries of that time, they often speak about they thought they were fighting for the freedom of generations unborn. They would use that phrase. And we are those generations. And they were fighting for us. So thank you all for tuning in this evening. If you can get to my website, sign up for the newsletter and get information about my other books. And thanks to the Bridgeport Library for having me on this evening.
Yeah, and I think if anybody has any questions, we can put it in the chat here. We do have a couple of questions here. From Robert Wong. There have been several books reassessing Arnold's career more favorably in the past 10 years. What new event or fact did you find that had not been previously written about?
Well, one thing and it's an interesting development in just the way history unfolds. A couple of years ago, there was a letter that was written by a gentleman who fought at the Battle of Saratoga, and he wrote to his sister 2 days after the battle, describing the interplay between Horatio Gates and Benedict Arnold on the battlefield. And that really went against a lot of the theories that had been thrown up against Arnold, that he hadn't been on the battlefield, that he and Gates had been in some kind of terrible dispute at the time. And that letter was found on eBay. Somebody's trying to sell it on eBay, and it was, I think, eventually ended up in the hands of the Saratoga battlefield. It didn't absolutely prove that, but it indicated and it pushed the interpretation of Saratoga in the direction of Arnold being more involved in the battle than had been previously thought. So there's always little things like that coming up that change our view of history.
And Robert also asked, how and when did Peggy Shippen join her husband, presumably in New York City? Was this willingly done by Washington?
Yes, the idea that she was an innocent victim of Arnold's plot, which was not true, but it was accepted by Washington and the other officers. They were such gentlemen that they felt that she deserved the benefit of the doubt. She protested her innocence. They let her go join her husband in New York. And when Benedict Arnold went to England after the war, she went with him. They had 5 kids. He had 3 sons by his first marriage. They had 5 more children over there. And she stayed faithful to him. She suffered for it. She never got to see much of her family again, and they were not really well accepted in Britain, particularly by the British Army officers who hated uh, Arnold as a traitor and also as an effective killer of British soldiers. So Arnold lived into to 1801, and Peggy, although she was much younger than him, died a few years later of cancer.
So I have a question. So why, how was Benedict Arnold an accomplished military leader without having any military experience?
Yeah, he had very limited experience before the war started, and I always attribute it, and it's hard, it's somewhat speculation, but the fact that he was a ship's captain. He had his own trading business down to the West Indies before the war, as his father had, and he had sailed as a young man or a teenager with his father. He took over these ships and sailed down to the West Indies, up to Canada, over to England, uh, while he was trading. And to be a ship's captain in those days, you really had to have a sense of command. You had to have an attention to detail, planning. A lot of these skills carried over into the military. And on occasion, Benedict Arnold and Valcour campaign being one of them, he was able to directly apply those nautical skills to the war, and he was uh, quite an expert on sailing and ships and preparing ships and building ships. So um, I would say that was his main thing. But I think it was also that once the war started, he just realized he had a gift, and he was a natural fighter.
Um, so another question: what happened to him after the treason? He's buried in England, and did he receive any type of like honors over there? Or
Well, he did get a fair amount of money. He didn't because he wasn't successful at handing over West Point. They didn't give him. I think they were talking about 20,000 pounds, which would have been an enormous fortune in those days. I think he got about 6,000 pounds. Peggy also got a stipend, an annual stipend that for her part in the plot. All of his sons were made given commissions in the British Army, which was a valuable step up for them. And they some of them were active participants in the army. But mostly he got back into trading and essentially took up where he left off when the Revolutionary War started. He always wanted to be a soldier again. He wanted to be an active military um, participant, but as I mentioned, the um, the British officers were not going to put up with that, and he was frustrated by it.
so we have another question from Robert. How many duels was he involved with? E.T. Lord Balcarres, etc., due to his honor being questioned slash impugned.
Yeah, I'm familiar with that. There was a duel that took place in England after he went back over to England. It's surprisingly he didn't really get involved in duels as quite a few uh, gentlemen and men of honor did in those days before the war. And he didn't fight any duels, as far as I know, during the Revolutionary War. So he was not involved in a lot of duels, but he did have a very prickly um, personality, and I think a lot of people would have been very wary of crossing him, fearful that they would get involved in a duel. Um, but that was certainly a custom of the time. But I don't think, as far as I know, that was the only one I can put my finger on that he was involved in. And that was somebody who backed down, I think, ultimately from it, just said that he hadn't meant to insult him. So he didn't want any part of Arnold either.
You mentioned Benedict Arnold was a successful businessman, and I think did you mention that it was a family business that was passed down to him, or
Yeah, his father had built up a trading business. Unfortunately, while Benedict Arnold was at school and was preparing to go to Yale, um, his father became an alcoholic and uh, basically became the town drunk. His business went down the tubes. Benedict Arnold had to be pulled out of school, put to work as an apprentice with some relatives of his mother, and it was a huge catastrophe for the family. And Benedict Arnold had to go out as a young man to go out and pick up your father from a tavern or lying in the street, because he was insensible with drink. It was a very searing experience. And Arnold was resentful that the people in the town looked down on his father because of that. That they, instead of trying to help him, they scorned him. So I think that was part of the uh, impetus for his sensitivity to his reputation and his honor. But he himself then picked up the line that his father had been in and was quite successful in it independently from his father on his own.
um, yeah, I don't see any more questions. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat. We might have time for one or two more. If anybody has, okay. So Robert also asked, did he have any specific grudge against New London, Groton Heights, that he burned?
Oh yeah, that was another Connecticut angle that I didn't get into mentioning, but after he'd gone over to the British, he fought down in Virginia for a while, came back to New York, and General Clinton, who was the British commander then, sent him off to New London. They were New London, as was Bridgeport, as were many of the coastal towns along Connecticut, were havens for privateers, and they would go out and prey on British shipping. So they wanted to teach them a lesson. They sent Arnold and a force of troops up on British ships. They landed at New London. There was really no resistance. They destroyed a lot of supplies. Again, it was destroying supplies in the town, and they burnt uh, a fair number of houses and warehouses and so forth in New London. And Arnold also sent a force over to take care of Fort Griswold, which was over on the Groton side of the river. And they defeated the little force of militia that were defending Fort Griswold. And after they did that, they killed all the men that had surrendered. And that was not necessarily ordered by Arnold, but he had been the commander, and it happened under his watch, so to speak. The, there was sort of almost an Oedipal complex involved in that. The fact that he was from Norwich, which was just a few miles north of New London, and was basically raiding his hometown as his last act in America. And it was not only his last act, but it was the last major action in the north of the war altogether. It was a short time before um, George Washington's victory at Yorktown, which was the final battle of the war. So uh, it left, to say the least, it left a bad taste in the mouth of the American patriots at uh, what Arnold had done there.
Um, I should also mention Michelle said thank you. Kara said thank you, Mr. Kelly, and thanks to Jeff in the library as well. Uh, Thank you for attending. We're glad we could have this, and we're glad you enjoyed it. Robert also said thank you. Um, so if we don't have any other questions, um, I just like to say thank you. Thank you to Jack Kelly. Thank you for a great presentation. Thank you everybody for coming. Please check our social media for other events. And please go to Jack Kelly's website, Jack Kelly Books, to find out more about his book. And have a great night, everyone.
Okay, thank you,
Thank
Jeff.
you.